and see. For me, when I started, that was my course. I was at a place where the Bible sounded really, really good to me. First time I ever read it was at 43. I won't tell you how long ago it is. That tells you how old I am. But when I first read it, it was great news to me because I was in a situation that was hope there was an afterlife, but I had no idea to think there might be. When I picked up the Bible, read it for the first time, I started some weird place that I called a friend. They said, no, start in John, Kelly. Don't start in Genesis. It'll be confusion. So that's what I did, and I started reading. And the one guy that stood out to me in the whole thing was Thomas. So this Thomas guy, I'm with him. I get it. I get why he's got questions. So I started reading the Bible, and I started picking up ideas that there was an afterlife, and this Jesus guy who had my daughter at this point, I want to know who this guy is. So that's when I started looking into it, and I guess the first thing that comes to mind, anybody's mind, about facts and history and the rest of it is that is it true? Right now we're kind of in a debate in our country on whether things are true or not, and you can have a truth and I can have a truth and they could both be true. Now, if we have the same one, of course, that's good. But if you have contradictory claims, like, I'll just pick this one because it's easy. The route Islam says go to heaven and the route that Christianity goes to heaven. If somebody were to tell you that's the same route, that can't be. I mean, not in our minds, we're Christians. So we, at least I assume everybody is. You came here on a Saturday at 10 in the morning. But we know it's through Jesus. But if somebody says to you, all paths lead to heaven, we also know that that's not a truthful statement either, right? At least Jesus said it wasn't. Jesus says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father except through me. I guess the biggest point that in that verse is right now that we're going through is he says he's the truth. But I was listening to a gentleman named John Lennox. I don't know how many of you guys know him. But he came out a great point that I really, really liked. He asked him about what is truth. And he said, well, truth is what you can verify, but also truth is a person. Jesus Christ is the truth. He's a person, and he brought the truth. He came to the world to bring the truth. And he came to confront things like this. This is Paul talking in Corinthians 2:8. It says, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on tradition, elemental spiritual forces of the world, rather than on Christ. For in Christ is the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form, and in Christ you have been brought to fullness. He is the head over every power and over authority. So I think what I see, and maybe you guys see the same thing, and maybe that's why you're here, is because it appears as though truth is being redirected, truth is being labeled as opinion. What we used to think of as opinion is now considered truth. So this, I'm not trying to pick on anything particular thing, but there's a video on YouTube about a senator, and he's interviewing a professor from Berkeley. And he's talking about this lady says something about the people who can give birth. That's what she was talking about, people who can give birth. And the senator said, well, is that the same as a woman? And this professor says, absolutely not. Women that transition to men, they can give birth too. And he said, well, do you think men can give birth? Yes, the ones who transition to men can give birth. And he said, well, that seems awfully strange to me. And she goes off. She starts in on him that he's transphobic. So that's an example of how not only is the fact that opinion is being pushed over to objective truth rather than subjective, the truth part is what we can determine as opposed to what our feelings are. What makes us happy is not necessarily true, and we're running into that in our society, I think. So anyway, as far as this study goes, with all that behind this, what we're looking for at the outset is what is truth. And I kind of came to that idea that truth is to be able to be known because God gave us a brain to know it, right? But as we search for truth, we need to know that truth is exclusive. Anybody can have it, but it's exclusive. It doesn't have 3 or 4 different meanings to it. It is just truth. And when I started the ministry, I do, well, how many of you guys know what I do, but I used to do a Redlands Street Fair ministry. It was called the Areopagus Project. And I think God set me up for that, because when I first read the Bible, I picked out Thomas. God said, okay, you can be Thomas. Let me show you some things like he did for him. So I waited around the house for 2 or 3 weeks, and as you can imagine, Jesus didn't show up, so I could poke my finger in his side. But what he did do is he had me go get some books. First one I read was Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and then Evidence Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell, and lots of other ones. Finally got to the point after a little while that I said, okay, I mean, I like this idea that God took my daughter to heaven, but was it true? So after I read these books, it started accumulating for me, like we're going to talk about, cumulative, circumstantial evidence. We don't have any direct evidence for the Bible or God. But what we're going to learn when we go into this assumptions, and which you got the book. If you don't, it's available in the bookstore. It's Cold Case Christianity. And the book talks about those, talks about direct evidence and also indirect evidence. Direct evidence is somebody that you can say, yes, I was there, and this is what happened. Now, that's what we have in the Bible, but we can't actually go and interview any of those guys anymore. They're all gone. So we can go to circumstantial evidence, and that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to show that truth, you can find it through indirect evidence, circumstantial evidence. We can find that. If you have a cumulative amount of it, and that's what a lot of court cases are solved on, because sometimes they won't have a witness. But if you read the book, he's going through some of the ones that are circumstantial evidence, and they found enough of it to the point where they could convict people. So anybody that tells you if you don't have direct evidence or that nobody's seen it, that's not necessarily true. A lot of court cases are solved without that. But anyway, that's why I started this, because I think our society is starting to kind of walk away from Christian values. And I think some of that might be just because, I want to live my life the way it made me happy instead of living the life for God. But just because it makes you happy doesn't make it true. Lots of things that can make me happy, but it's necessarily true. Tomorrow, I could hear the IRS isn't going to have taxes anymore. That would make me happy. But unfortunately, it's not true. So anyway, that's what we're doing. We're trying to search for truth. And we're going down the road with ideas that are brought up by J. Warner Wallace in his Cold Case Christianity. And we're going to run through that. So give a little introduction there a little bit. And then we'll get back over to Jay's section. We're going to go back and forth between us.
Good morning. You should all have 2 handouts. One is the problem of evil and suffering. Somebody brought that up at our first session, and I said we'll give a response to that. This is the response. We're not going to take any time today on this because we got a lot of other information to cover, but if there's still questions, see me after. There's a video on the Packing House Tuesday Night Men's Study that explains a little bit about it too, and that can be shared with an unbeliever. It is another use possibly for that video. The other handout is the What is Truth handout. This is just kind of an overview to get us grounded in the truth issue, and the logical place to start appears to be the definition of truth. What is a generally accepted definition of truth? So here it is from Merriam-Webster: conformity to fact or actuality. What is factually true? Does this story have any truth? Well, we can certainly see that in the sense that we can look at biblical stories, right?
Sure can, yes, absolutely. And those are ones that there's parts of it that you can't necessarily examine, like Jesus dying on the cross. There's no pictures for that. There's no physical evidence of it, but you can get the circumstantial part of it. But on the other hand, there's also archaeological truth. archaeological truth is vast for the Bible. All the way back to Moses in Mount Sinai. You can actually go and visit that now on a tour. They found it, and that's the real one, not the one in Saudi Arabia, or the peninsula. But all along, and then after that, the book of Judges, there's these things they call the Armana Stela, just means stones. It's rocks that the Canaanites were communicating with. And one of the particular rocks was, I'm getting off on this a little bit.
That's
nobody's
okay,
trying. One of the rocks was a letter from a Canaanite king to an Egyptian king. Now, we don't know when the Canaanite king lived. They don't keep records. But we know when the Egyptian king lived. And it was a letter to the Egyptian king from a Canaanite king asking to send him military help because these people he called the Habirus were invading all of his cities and taking them. That's direct evidence of the book of Judges. That's exactly what was going on. After that, we also have David's name mentioned in Egypt as the king of Israel. We've just found that not that long ago. And then the Taylor Stele, which talks about the invasion of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians and the fact that they didn't take Jerusalem. Even they are admitting that. And as we know, the Bible talks about that. Talks about the fact that the Assyrians came in, they're mocking God, and Hezekiah went up to him and said, this is what they're saying about you. And God killed 187,000 Assyrian soldiers, and they didn't take Jerusalem. And the Assyrian memos say the same thing. They don't talk about the killed soldiers. They just say that they didn't take Jerusalem. So all those things add up. And as you're starting to review those, I think that's what we're talking about with truth. Can you verify these things? Some of it you can't, but you can make a circumstantial case that it's very well documented that the Bible is a document written at the time by the people that wrote it.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there's a lot of extra biblical corroboration for the Bible.
Absolutely.
Okay, so there's other writings, there's archaeological digs.
There's one from, now you guys probably know this one, it's pretty well known, but Roman senator named Tacitus. He was alive during the time when the apostles from the 50s to the early 65 or so. He was alive, he was a kid, but he was watching. And he wrote about it in 116 AD. And he talked about, his book was about Nero burning Rome. And through that book, he wasn't trying to promote Christ, he was a pagan. But what he did in that book was he came to the point where Nero burned Rome, and he started blaming the Christians for it. Mm-hmm. And he started talking about who these, just as an aside, he started talking about who these Christian people are. Well, these guys are the ones that follow that guy that got crucified by Pilate in Palestine. And shortly after that, they were quiet for a while, but shortly after that it revived, and they're here now in number. So that's a pagan witness of Christ being crucified in Palestine by Pilate. Those are some documents that are hard to argue with. If your presuppositions, I guess we're going to get into that here soon. The presupposition part is, where's your mindset at? Can you allow for truth to come in? And a lot of people that we talk to these days don't allow for truth to come in. But we were talking about this earlier. It isn't our job to let them open their mind to it. That's not our job. Our job is just to tell people about the truth that is the Bible and the truth that is our faith. And it's not just, the old saying, check your brain at the door before you walk into the church. Well, that certainly isn't this one, because our pastor's a microbiologist and pretty sharp guy. So anyway, what we're getting at is I think you can determine truth, and I think an examination of it gives us the fact that the Bible has recorded events as they happened.
And the point it being is that the Bible squares up with reality. Here's our second definition: truth, reality, actuality. The apologist knows that biblical truth aligns with reality. And that's a very important thing. It's not a book of fables. The reality of a situation, that's a situation where we can observe, we know what is going on. Perhaps in your life, in your faith journey, you saw somebody who was changed, and you can't explain why. Maybe you changed and you can't explain why. That's me. And so there is a reality there where we know that something is going on with humanity And we also know that historically, there is a lot of evidence very early on outside of the Bible about people who experienced life changes, and it's just unexplainable. It's not a self-help program. They had a radical transformation. So how do we determine facts and reality? And this is, as we go through this exploration of what is truth, here are the three things that seem to be pertinent. One is we examine events as they are unfolding. This is our own perception of the world around us, and we examine that. We investigate past events. In other words, we investigate history. If it's not happening right now, it's history. Where you parked your car is history. What's happening here right now is, sound waves are emanating. That's now. And then with these matters, we determine the facts from the evidence and apply logical analysis, meaning we use reasoning, and that's what Kelly was alluding to there. That's a proof of God, if I can digress there, right? How did your mind come out of inert minerals? To believe that your mind, your thinking, your desires came out of inert material that requires more faith than I have.
A load more. I read one recently that was talking about how life might have emerged. They have all kinds of stories. Speculation is all it is. But a couple different ones, for example, now they're saying that life came from the ocean floor and the ocean vents, they're popping out hot water. And I mean, we're going to get into all this with the existence of God. Does God exist? We're going to get into all of it. But like Jay was saying, where are you getting the instructions for DNA from a water vent? Please tell me how that is. And I would tell you what, I'll believe that the first time a book pops out of that water vent and has some pages written on it, okay? You give me some proof and I'll believe it. And then the other one is they're looking for planets out in the universe that might have water there. Well, it's true, life does need water, but water does not produce life. They've got it backwards. And like I said, I think that's what Paul was talking about, this deceitful philosophy that they're trying to push on us. And he warned us about it way back 2,000 years ago, because it was happening then too. And that deceptive philosophy is something that we need to encounter. Because when you hear something like that, I mean, if you see it on the TV, whatever, that's what they do. But if somebody comes to you and starts talking about that, I think it's good to have a response. Say, well, okay, does that seem odd to you that could happen? That an ocean vent popping water out could possibly produce a human being? Or any type of thing at all that's got instructions for use? It's just trying to gently talk to people about what's true and what's empty philosophy. And without any facts behind it, it's just imagination. And once you allow imagination to come in as fact, then you start believing anything. What was the old sign? If you stop believing in God, anything's possible. Everything's possible.
Well,
I don't think I got that quote right, but we'll think about that one.
You obviously felt very inspired, for lack of a better word, on cold case Christianity. And that's why we launched with this book. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of, find out what was it about the book that prompted you to want to
try to do this.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think when we're talking to people about God, I think you can classify it as a court case. You're the defending attorney for God, and if you run into somebody that's an atheist, for example, they're the defending attorney for their side of the story. And that part, when I was reading the book, he was starting to talk about cases he was in, and right at the start, I didn't follow that all that well, and then he started talking about how it applies to us when we're preaching the gospel to somebody. He started talking about the fact that that you don't have to have eyewitnesses. The court system, like Jay knows, he's an attorney, but the court case will tell you that direct evidence and circumstantial evidence are equal. You can evaluate either one and decide to take it or not take it, but they're equal. Direct and circumstantial evidence are equal in proof. That's what made me start thinking about this cold case. I had read a couple other books before I got to this one, but it was just interesting that this guy was a detective, and detectives do run down the road to find out what's true, right? That's what they do. They interview people, they watch them, they listen to what they say, which was really interesting when they talk about the witness's language. You guys, if you read it, you may have read about the one where they were trying to figure out where this one lady got murdered, and they could not figure out who did it. Wallace came back. Voice is going. Wallace came back and he started opening up the case, and he said, well, I want to talk to this boyfriend again. This boyfriend that admitted up front that they had a little bit of a rocky relationship. That wasn't enough to prove they killed her. But he was listening to what this guy said. And what this boyfriend said, I hated to see her dead. I skipped right over that first when I first read it, but there's a key point in that. I hated to see her dead. The guy admitted what his fault was right there. But that's part of what you have to pay attention to is when people are talking, trying to figure out where they're coming from. So listen. I think it's good to listen carefully when someone's talking to someone when you talk to somebody about God, where they're coming from. So, for example, if you're talking to Jehovah's Witness, you don't really have to go down the road of proving God. They already know that. But you have to show that their theology might be a little messed up. But where you need to start, if you're talking to an atheist, then sometimes you have to give them a little bit of evidence towards why they should think God exists.
Well, I think,
and that's what this is. That's what J. Warner Wallace goes down that road. Right now, we're going through the facts of court cases, but a little later he's going to start bringing up why it is that he thinks God exists, the circumstantial evidence behind it.
very cool.
Yeah. So that was one of the reasons why it was such a good source for me.
Oh, that's great. Well, it sounds like when you're talking and listening, maybe sometimes if it's practical to have a follow-up conversation, because sometimes we don't appreciate what somebody's saying until we're driving away or we think about it the next day.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a suggestion. The other thing that strikes me out of all this is that when we look at a court case, all we're hearing is one side of the case. I mean, what kind of juror would listen to one side present, say, opening statement, and then walk into the jury room and render a verdict? What kind of fairness, what would you think about a juror that would do that? Unreasonable, right? This person's not being reasonable, but isn't this what is going on? I mean, in my travels, people that proclaim atheism, they're not only looked at the evidence for atheism, they just haven't looked at the evidence at all. And more I'm hearing that people don't really have firm views. They want to latch onto a concept like atheism, but they really cannot back it up with any sort of analysis. And I suppose a potential would be if somebody's resisting, you wouldn't go into a jury room on the prosecutor's opening statement and render a verdict. What would you do? You'd listen to the evidence. You'd want to hear both sides of the story. Anybody that has been a juror knows that you sit in there and you hear the first guy talk, whether it's the prosecutor or the plaintiff's attorney in a civil matter, and it sounds good. And then you hear the other lawyer get up and what the other lawyer believes the evidence is going to show, and all of a sudden it's, well, that sounds good too. Now we're in this quandary of how do we decide, and of course the judge will instruct that, or has instructed, that you're not supposed to take these opening remarks as evidence. You're supposed to look into the evidence. And so if we're going through this exercise on whether somebody should pay money or not, or whether somebody should go to the gas chamber or not, why would we do it any other way for the eternal destiny of our souls? That seems a little silly. Because if what the Bible says is true about eternity, it sounds like it would be something we might want to investigate.
Right. Because as much as as annoying as atheists can be, God loves them. And he doesn't want them going where they're going. He wants them to turn around, realize the truth, and meet Jesus. That's what he wants us to do. Is all of them going to happen? No. But we don't know that. And when we're talking to somebody about God, and you're trying to get them to consider, and maybe they're putting up a block, they do usually, but that doesn't matter, because what we're supposed to do is just give out the truth, pound out the truth. I can't change anybody's mind about it. That has to come from God. The other part we're going to get into as well here soon is the fact that, like the Bible says, when you are talking to somebody who doesn't believe, you're not really warring with them. You're warring with who's behind them. The enemy is the one who is bringing deceitful stuff into all realms. The academia, with few exceptions, is starting to get to the point where they're teaching atheism. And yeah, you might, as you start examining it, you wonder how they get away with that. But if it's a closed off society, then it's difficult. Another reason why I think this is important to have the facts behind Christianity is to probably try to confront that. Whereas academia is trying to teach that God doesn't exist. Actually, they said, New York Times says God is dead. Not that he actually died, but he doesn't exist anymore. I don't take much of the New York Times. What they say is true anyway. But those things are there, and I think it's important for us to be able to confront that. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we're going to go over briefly the first 5 chapters of presuppositions. Chapter 1, reasonableness. Chapter 2, direct and circumstantial evidence, witness reliability, and witness language. And these tools can be used for evidence for God, the Bible, and the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that as you read the book, Wallace says he has a presupposition. I'm a materialist. I don't believe any of this stuff about miracles and the rest of it. How could somebody rise from the dead, walk on water, do all this stuff? I'm a materialist. That's what Wallace was. And as he was also a detective, he said, okay, well, I see some of my friends. That's one of the stories he told. I see one of my friends come in and he makes an assumption right off the bat about a particular incident. And the presupposition told him this is the way it's going to be. But as they examined a little closer, if you read it, this is the kid that died in the bed. As you read it, you realize this guy loved his kid. He would never have harmed that kid. He may not have been a very good housekeeper, but he loved that kid. And the presuppositions, and when the attorneys came in, they saw this mess. They knew this guy was on drugs because he'd been caught before doing it. So he figured that he had killed his kid. But once the coroner arrived and turned the kid over, they said, there's no wounds. He just suffocated because the pillow fell off the side of the bed. So presuppositions are something that can get in the way for sure. And that's what Wallace was too. He was an atheist. He was a materialist. And finally it came to the point, he said, well, in my job, I come in and I'm supposed to have an open mind to it. See what it is, where the evidence leads. And that's one of the things he was animate about was try to leave your presuppositions behind. Just go with what you see, what's the best explanation, most reasonable. Yeah, we don't go for possible doubt. We go for reasonable doubt. And that's one other thing that I liked about the fact that there is this idea of possible doubt. Several different things. The theory of evolution, for example, is a possible doubt that God created everything. But is that presupposition, are you going to let that completely influence your mind, or are you going to be open to what's testable about that particular theory? So
Very cool.
That's kind of the presupposition part.
Well, let's go through the first 5 chapters then. What is presupposition? That's kind of a fancy word. To presuppose to accept that something is true before it has been proved. Now, that's something that we might be accused of doing, but we don't have to do it that way, and that's why we're here. Assume, to accept something to be true without question or proof. And this is what Kelly was alluding to with Darwinism. There has been this incredible assumption that goes on, and it is something that is easily, I believe, with science and math, undercut, not just necessarily the Bible. So I think there's maybe something that would be important to point out, and that is that we use reason, but reason will not give you revelation. You use reason to examine revelation, but you can't get revelation from reason alone. And so the classic example is the Greek philosophers believed that the earth was the center of the universe based upon reason. And when telescopes came into being, revelation came in and said, no, that's not it at all. Einstein attempted to reason that the universe was infinite. And then Edwin Hubble, right here at Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles County, could prove that no, that's not true, that the stars were moving away and therefore there was a point of beginning. It completely undercut. So again, a telescope undercut the revelation that came through the telescope, undercut revelation. Well, when we go to the question of the supernatural, the question of eternity, the question of God, revelation is important, because when we're dealing with presuppositions, one of the most important things to consider are presuppositions like there's nothing outside of the natural realm. That's a presupposition. That the science of the material world can explain everything, and then perhaps most importantly, presuppositions about God himself, what are known as category errors, right? Mm-hmm. What would you say about that, Kelly?
Right. Well, the last one there, that the Bible was written late by people rewriting history to advance their religious beliefs. Well, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to the can you trust the New Testament? But there's documentation, mainly in the book of Acts, and Acts proves that the Bible wasn't written late. Now, the copies that we have, those are all afterwards. There's one that was late first century, early second century of John. But the book of Acts demonstrates the fact that those books were written at the latest in the 60s. Luke, the book of Acts was written in the 60s for sure. At least that's what you can deduce from literature. Whenever anybody examines literature, they try to figure out when this book was written. Now, they can talk about things that happened, and it could have been written late, but when they omit things that did happen that are crucial to a story, talking about the death of Paul and Peter, Acts was written by Luke, and he was following Paul and Peter. That's his two main characters. He didn't have any problem dealing with death and writing about it, because he did write about Stephen's death. But when the death of the main characters in this whole biography is the book of Acts, the main characters, Peter and Paul, he didn't mention why they died or how they died. And both of those men died in the middle 60s. So if that was left out, then the common reasonable assumption, like I said, reasonable is not possible, but reasonable assumption was the book was written before then, right? If we have a book now that comes out about John F. Kennedy, and they talk about his presidency, but they leave out him getting assassinated in Texas, what would be our common thought about that book? It was probably written before that happened. So that's the Bible part.
Well,
priest-
what about
yeah.
God? I mean, I think this is hugely important. Do you find that people have misconceptions about the nature of God?
Yeah, depending on sometimes, unfortunately, how Christians have treated them, but that isn't God. That's just people. People do stupid stuff sometimes. But I think the cumulative evidence, and we're going to get there next time around, we're going to get there on the cumulative evidence of God. It's vast. And to just try to stick in your brain that God doesn't exist and the only thing that can be is material causation, you run into some major problems with that idea. That the only thing that can happen is non-supernatural. And in particular, that thing you were talking about with Hubble demonstrating that the universe had a beginning, since Aristotle, 2,300 years before that fact came, everybody thought the universe was eternal. It was a static state. A guy named Fred Hoyle, he was a knighted mathematician and cosmologist in England, Einstein, they both thought that the universe was eternal. It didn't have a start. It's always been here. And when they found this fact that the universe is expanding, well, if the universe is expanding, then it's reasonable to think it used to be smaller. Now, time frame doesn't really matter. But the Bible's always said that it had a beginning. In Genesis, it said it had a beginning. And also, the first chapter of John says the same thing, in the beginning. And they're saying God was already there. So it had a start. That was a major problem. I was listening to John Lennox again. That was a major disturbance from the 50s and 60s that fact happened. The fact that the universe had a beginning. Cosmology and atheism didn't like that one little bit. They thought, okay, you guys are trying to pull something on us here. And they were very upset about it. But they finally came to the conclusion, Hawking and it's Penrose. Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose came to the conclusion that time, space, matter, and energy all had a start. And that's exactly what Genesis says. In that order, in fact. So the presupposition there got kind of blown out of the water. And they were pretty upset about it, but they're still upset about it when you talk about it.
What were those again? Time, space?
Matter and energy all had a start.
And if you look at the first few verses of Genesis, they're all there.
That's exactly what it says. It says, in the beginning, time. The universe, in the beginning. No, my brain just went blank. I was thinking, just gosh, my goodness, how did that happen? Go ahead and quote it for me, Jay, because my brain went blank.
Well, in the
can't believe I
beginning,
love
God
that
created the universe, and He created
Heavens
the
and the
world
earth,
and
yeah.
matter. So He's created space, and He's created matter, and in the beginning is time. And then a couple verses later, He says, "Let there be light,"
Which is
and
energy,
that's
right?
energy. That's the point. And so we know that all of those things had a beginning, and that's accepted Christian doctrine. I think the other thing that when you want to go at it from a science standpoint, if you say that matter, for example, had a beginning, then what is the scientific proof that something could be created from nothing? Okay, and so, a lot of what we do is framing the debate, and the burden of proof. And of course, people want to throw that burden on us, but, this is a two-way street. And so if somebody says, the first thing is it a factual proposition that the universe had a beginning? That time, space, matter, at least, had a beginning? Yes. That's not just Hawking and Penrose. There's been people that have mathematically calculated it. They've worked it back to the original singularity. This is an accepted scientific fact. So if somebody says, yes, that's true, then tell me, using the scientific method, how matter could be created from nothing.
Yeah. Matter can't cause its own existence because it doesn't exist yet. That's a strange idea. I mean, it's a simple idea, but a lot of people don't believe it. They have these strange ideas, they'll also tell you there's no facts. There's nothing in the Bible that's ever proved science to be wrong. That is garbage. That one that we're talking about right now, Genesis has said that for 3,500 years, that the universe had a beginning. And for 2,300 years, the regular scientists didn't think it was true. Even some that claimed Christian didn't think it was true. And I guess Aristotle could have came up with that idea. When he comes outside, it's always the same thing going on in the sky. They can see the same planets at the same time. But that idea of what would be if the universe was always here would be called what's infinite regression, an unending series of events in the past. That's crazy. That every physicist will tell you that's nonsense. That can't be. That just can't be. And I think that's why Einstein and Hubble were so critical of their own thoughts. Einstein said it's the biggest mistake I ever made. I can't believe that I used to think this. There's so much stuff that makes this not true. And Hubble and not Hubble, Fred Hoyle said the same thing. He said, that's by the way, that's who came up with the Big Bang thing. And he didn't say it as complimentary. It was derogatory. He said the whole thing started with the Big Bang, and I hate it. He was upset because he knew what the ramifications are of things starting. Because if something starts to exist, that has a cause. That's an effect. If something starts to exist, it's the effect. And you have to have a cause, right? I have a cause. My mom and dad. I have a cause, and they had one too. So that's the simple explanation of cause and effect, but it's valid. And it's one of the major problems for atheism to deal with. And like Jay was saying, when you're speaking to an atheist, when I talk to them all the time. I've been on councils with them. Well, I thought about doing that, but anyway, I did. Their explanation ends very quickly, and they usually just try to turn it around on you. So you have to prove what you can. Okay, you're right, I do. I have a certain opinion, and I have to prove it. And I have to demonstrate with facts and with maybe science, maybe history, maybe archaeology, but I have to come up with proof. But here's the thing, you gotta turn that back on them. So you have a worldview as well. You have an atheistic worldview. You have to have some facts as well. We have examples of the earth, of the universe having a start. We have examples of life and the incredibly precise series of instructions that are in DNA. You please tell me where that came from. Please tell me how that got here from some material causation. So it's a two-way street. We have to prove what we say. I agree, we do. Well, that's what we're here for. But on the other hand, when you're talking to one that's an atheist and maybe get a little upset, but you turn around and say, well, do you just have belief? You don't have anything that you can show as proof? That's what you would call religious. If an atheist tells that to you, say, well, you're telling me that I have to have proof for my side. I have to have some documentation. And I agree with you, I do. But you have to do the same thing. Otherwise, you just have what you call religious faith. And as Jay's been talking about it, and I found as well, they don't. Atheism is void of anything can explain origins. Atheism is just void of it. They don't have anything.
Well, maybe this is a good time to talk about the chapter 2 then on reasonableness. This is the thing that struck me about the book. I kind of solidified my thinking. When somebody says prove it, right, that in my mind raises a question. What's your standard of proof? What sort of burden of proof are you trying to impose here? And I think for me personally, the criminal standard of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt, we've all heard this, right, is to me the gold standard for this. It's a standard that I'm very comfortable working with when I'm talking to somebody. I'm comfortable with beyond a reasonable doubt. And what's the flip side of that? That once something has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, to deny it then brings into question the person's reasonableness. Is it now reasonable to continue doubting? You know, we get these things in court where you have a criminal case and you've got 11 jurors that are going to go for, say, a conviction. The evidence that the prosecution has put on is monumental, and there's a holdout. And the holdout can't support the position. It's very frustrating for the reasonable people, meaning the 11, to deal with the unreasonable person, because as you may also know, in criminal cases, it has to be unanimous. And so when we apply beyond a reasonable doubt to life, like, is my brake pedal going to work when I exit the freeway? When I sit in the chair, am I going to hit the deck, or is it going to hold me up? You know, then we start to say things like, well, is there a difference between what is possible and what is reasonable? And that's what Warner gets into, especially when he talks about avoiding speculation.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, the possible doubt, that's if somebody says, well, there could be something else. If you're in a court case and the attorney's laid out a plan why this guy is guilty, the defense attorney is going to have to come up and explain why he's not. And one of the things that the judge would laugh at him about is that, let's say they proved beyond a reasonable doubt, they have witnesses seeing the guy go in the door, they were having an argument before that, the neighbors say these guys are always fighting, and 3 or 4 different people saw him go into the room with the gun in his hand, gunshot went off, and the person's got bullet holes in her. And this guy ran down the road. When it comes to the court case, they can't find the gun. They can't find the gun anywhere. They got all this other evidence. And the defense attorney says, well, one day we might be able to find the gun, and that means that it could not have been, maybe not his gun, somebody else did it. The judge is going to laugh at him. He's going to say, well, okay, produce it. And that might be a reason why you come back here and try for a new trial. But as it stands right now, you have no evidence. You can't put this speculation of what we might find in the future as evidence for now.
Right, and that applies to many things about the Bible, but in the context of apologetics or evangelism in general, you will have people that will say things like, well, if there's any possible explanation other than God, I will not believe it. But the point that Wallace is making, and this is the thing that hit me very hard when I read his book, is that's not reasonable. That's not how we make life decisions. We make life decisions by weighing evidence and applying some kind of standard of proof.
Right.
And so
the idea of life coming from an ocean vent, that would be one of those. I mean, you think about that for a minute, and anybody should think about that for a minute. Say, well, that's absurd. That's just pure speculation. You have no way to demonstrate that could actually happen. And like I said, show me a book that pops out of the ocean vent, and I'll believe you. Without that, I'm sorry, you got too much speculation going on here.
the other thing in this chapter that I thought was interesting was this term abductive reasoning. That's not something I was necessarily, I understood the concept, I'd never heard the name before. We have deductive reasoning, right? Deductive reasoning, making an inference based on widely accepted facts or premises. We're deducing from a large body of evidence, we're deducing something. Inductive reasoning is where we make an observation and then we make a more generalized conclusion. Wallace is saying, well, there's also abductive reasoning, which is making a probable conclusion from what you know. And this may be a little uncomfortable. This sounds squishy, but what, especially in terms of the God question, the evidence is so overwhelming that abductive reasoning, I feel, really comes into play. This is back to this cumulative thing that just keeps permeating everything, right? The more evidence we have, the more comfortable I become, most people become, you become comfortable with the conclusions to be drawn. And this is back to, this element of reasoning. We had our back to our original, kind of analysis of reality. We determine the facts and apply logical analysis. We use reasoning, and so that's what is needed. The presuppositions can get in the way of that, but also I think it's important that we have the ability to reason through our faith if we're going to take somebody and help them on their faith journey.
Mm-hmm. Or even if it just like it did for me and Jay, we've talked about it. These ideas that we're examining, just it doesn't necessarily have to be for evangelism. For me, when I started reading the Bible, I thought these stories would be nice, but is any of it true? And as I gathered information from people a lot smarter than me, writing books, I came to understand that this isn't some fantasy idea of Jesus and God being real. The facts are that it demonstrates they are. And that helped my faith a lot. That really made a big difference to me. Because, we all run into trouble. We all run into times when things are not going so well. But if you keep in mind that God is real, He really is with you all the time, no matter what's going on, He's always there, that helps me. I'm sure it helps you guys as well. Because we know God loves us. We know He's there. And when you first come to faith like what I did, it was good to be able to have these type of books and this type of information like what Mr. Wallace does as well, just to make it so I can reasonably believe that what's being said to me is true. Now, if I would have when I came to faith, I would have had a bunch of Mormons around me or Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly Mormons, then I would have came down that road and I would have started investigating and finding out that there's all kinds of problems here. There's stories that don't make any sense at all in the Book of Mormon, and you had to make an evaluation at that point of whether you can believe any of this stuff to be true. Which, I'm not trying to put down Mormons, but the idea that their ideas that they display, they don't turn out to be true. You can't back them up. And what I discovered when I was going through this, when I first came to faith, was that what the Bible talks about, it's all true. Maybe tiny little bits of it here and there we don't have any proof for, but the rest of it is. So I'm just going with the stuff that's provable, the overwhelming cumulative evidence that it's true. That's enough for me. And one of the first guys I read, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, that was his journey as well. His wife came to faith. He did not like it one little bit. If you've ever seen the movie, you can see it. He was going to leave her. He was mad at her all the time. He was getting convicted. But he decided to go out and decide, okay, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm going to show my wife this not to be true. It's just a bunch of nonsense, a bunch of fantasy. So he started going to all the experts. And along the way, he's just had this board where he's keeping track of what's right and what's wrong. And finally, he came to the point where he talked to one of the guys. His name escapes me right this minute. But he talked to one of the guys about it, and he was giving him some information as far as the Bible being true. And Lee Strobel started giving up some objections. And the guy said to him, he says, well, okay, it's possible stuff, like what we're talking about, was what Lee Strobel came up with, possibilities. And the guy said back to him, he says, well, okay, what is it going to take for you to believe? How much information do you have to have? How much evidence do you have to have? And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. If we're talking to people and they're constantly with this possibility stuff, possibility. How much evidence do you need?
I think the other thing to keep in mind is a scientific concept called Occam's razor, and that is that the simplest explanation is the best explanation. And that can apply to many, many things. Something came from nothing. The best explanation is it was a force outside of nature. That's what I land on. Maybe somebody lands on something different. The thing that convinced Strobel was circumstantial evidence, and so maybe we should go to that now. Direct and circumstantial evidence. So if we have a witness on the witness stand, and the lawyer's asking him, well, when you walked outside and looked up at the sky, what did you see? Or did you see anything? Yes. What did you see? I saw a jet fly by. Well, that would be direct evidence of a jet flew by when he exited the building. Let's say that the testimony is a little different. When you walked outside, did you see and looked up, did you see anything? Yes. What did you see? I saw a vapor trail. Okay, that would be direct evidence of a vapor trail. It would also be indirect evidence that a jet flew by. Okay, it may not be conclusive evidence that a jet flew by, but it would be circumstantial evidence of that fact. And so the power, as we've alluded to now several times, of evidence, whether it's direct or circumstantial, is how much evidence and how convincing is the evidence. But whether evidence is direct or circumstantial in the eyes of the law, they are to be treated equally. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily have equal credibility given the circumstances. A witness can get up and say he or she observed something, and a jury could just simply choose to disbelieve for whatever reason, based on the evidence, we hope, to believe that person's testimony, even though that's direct evidence. The jury could choose not to believe that witness in favor of an alternative set of facts based upon only circumstantial evidence. So when somebody says, prove it, we're back to that now, because that's the mantra that we hear, I hear, you hear. Well, what's your standard of proof and what evidence are you looking at? Because in the eyes of the law, direct and indirect evidence are the same. And it's interesting to me that Wallace brought up this point that it's actually, in a way, better that we don't have an original manuscript. It's actually better that we have a whole lot of copies that from different sources, that when put together, one can conclude, based upon the circumstantial evidence of all these manuscripts, what did the original say? Because if we had the original and everybody said, yeah, this was actually the original, it could have been altered, you see? But because we don't have the direct evidence, meaning the actual item, but we have circumstantial evidence of what that item was, there's actually more credibility for what did the original say.
Yeah.
So, I think we're down to
Witness reliability?
witness reliability. There's one other thing I just wanted to mention. It does come up, it's not mentioned in the book, but it's something to think about, and that is the importance of the absence of evidence. This comes in with, where are the writings that contradict the biblical account? Where are the writings that can credibly negate the eyewitness testimony of the Gospels? It does not exist. I mentioned this last month. I did an AI search. As soon as this ChatGPT came out, I was on it. And one of the first things I wanted to know is, where are the writings contradicting the Bible, other ancient writings? The closest that would come was Origen contradicting Celsus. He was an apologist in the 200s, responding to a Greek. But the Greek didn't deny that the miracles happened, didn't deny that the resurrection happened, but chalked it up to sorcery, which is an implied admission that these things happened. And so, for me personally, you may have your own thoughts about this. The absence of credible writings. I mean, think about it this way. The Jewish people that are non-believers, the non-Messianic Jews, have a thing called the Talmud. There's some things in the Talmud about Christ, but none of it is negating the fact of miracles, the fact of the resurrection. They didn't, 3,000 people come to faith in Jerusalem within 50 days of the resurrection. Where is the evidence that that didn't happen? Where is the evidence that from 1 Corinthians 15 that 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus at one time? There's no record of this. I think of Sherlock Holmes. There's a short story, Sherlock Holmes story, Hounds of the Baskervilles. And on the night of the murder, the hounds didn't bark, which led Sherlock to conclude that the murderer must have been the owner of the dogs. You see. So what is not there can be as important as what is there.
Right, yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at with Acts, the book of Acts. The fact that he didn't see anything about Peter or Paul's death. That's a reasonable conclusion to say that the book was written before then.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then witness reliability, that's an interesting one as well. Because, witnesses can be biased. Somebody commits a murder, his mother is going to get on the stand and try to say that he didn't. Well, she may be telling the truth, but it's got to be in your head. She loves her son, and she wants to get him off somehow, right? But that's in your head. She may be telling the truth, and she may not be that way, but you at least have that in your head a little bit. So when you start talking about the people that wrote the Bible, what is their motivation for writing this? Now, they say they were eyewitnesses. I believe they were. But what was the motive for them to go out and do what they did? What was their motive? You start looking at what happened to them, and to try to say that they were trying to, like I hear sometimes that the early Christians were just trying to control people. Give me a break. They were running for their lives most of the time. And the fact that they decided they were going to go out and write this book and challenge the Jewish authorities on what was believed, and for that matter, the Romans too. The Romans felt that Caesar was God. And these Christians running around that wouldn't admit to that, they'd kill him. So you look at those and you wonder, okay, what's the motivation for these guys doing this? Why are they doing this? There's nothing but negative here, other than the fact that what they actually saw, that's what they're reporting. They're just reporting what they saw. And if you don't believe it, that's up to you. But this is what we saw. And this is the type. And Paul said was to some people that were objecting, he said, you can go ask them. There's 500 people that saw Jesus alive after his death. Some of them aren't alive anymore, but there's a lot of them that are. Go ask them. Paul was going that same road. Go ask them. And the complete turnaround, we're going to get to those verses, but the complete turnaround was right then. The world changed at that point. The way the Greeks treated people, the way the Romans treated people, it all changed. In particular, treatment of women. Women did, in the Greek and the Roman society, women had no rights whatsoever, none. Matter of fact, in the Greek society, married women were so without any rights that women started to, it's sad to say, but women started to be prostitutes instead of getting married, because the prostitutes had better rights than they did. When Christ came around and when Constantine finally decided we're going to take Christianity as our model to build the government, that all changed. People had rights because Christ said it's all equal at the cross. And then everybody started having rights. And slaves didn't have rights either. That was something that people complained about, their slavery mentioned in the Bible. Well, yeah, there is, because it was there. But Christians didn't have anything to do with that. They were trying to stop it.
Very cool.
So anyway, yeah, I feel that the witness testimony is strong, real strong. There's just no motive for them to do what they did. The other thing is they were spread out all over the place. Thomas was in India, Peter was in Rome, Paul was in Rome, the other disciples were scattered around, and they're telling this story that people say they made it up. They made up this story. Now, they're at the point of death. Like I said, if you don't claim that Caesar's God, then we're going to kill you. We're going to cut your head off, whatever it is. And if one of the apostles was there, and so I'm telling this story, I'm not going to do that, how does he know the other guys are going to keep the same story if they made it up? at the point of death, are you going to lie about, are you going to say that this story is true when it's really not? And they didn't have cell phones then either. So Peter in India can't contact, or Thomas in India can't contact Peter in Rome and say, you are going to keep this story going, right? I mean, it's one we made up. You're going to keep this going, right? So the witness reliability is just strong for the biblical text.
Right, and Warner Wallace makes that point in the book about how hard it is to maintain a conspiracy. And that really does get to the heart of a common objection to the gospel narratives, that this was some sort of after the fact made up account by people wanting to believe. And a careful examination of things like how hard it would have been to maintain a conspiracy, what the motivations are, etc. The 5 things that are looked at in a court of law for witness reliability in general: 1, the ability to see and perceive events. Okay, so in other words, a witness to be believable has to be present and be able to cognitively, process what's going on. 2, the ability to recall events. If somebody sees it but can't recall it, that's not very reliable, right? The presence or absence of bias. The presence of motive, and then the witness's attitude while testifying. So those are the things that can be used in evaluating the Gospels. And in evaluating, we know, for example, John is very direct about his gospel. This is what we handled him. We touched him. We know that Matthew, of course, was also an eyewitness. Warner Wallace goes into the fact that Mark was probably the scrivener for Peter, who was an eyewitness. That leaves us with Luke. Luke is kind of like a journalist, right? He's the Lee Strobel of the group.
Yep.
And he was conducting witness interviews for this Theophilus fellow that we don't really know.
Yeah.
But that's what we have. And the other thing I think that, in addition, that I think is very, very important, that was brought up by Wallace, is the fact that the testimony of the gospel accounts has corroborating evidence to it. It's not just what they're saying, but there's corroboration from the words being used, the events, the history that we've talked about, the archaeology.
Yeah, it's verifiable. It's I think the best explanation for what we see, and the reason why you want to do this is we're going to learn with you guys and come along and learn as you go, to be able to be better witnesses, and not only that, but just to build our faith. We got a couple verses here we'd like to read, and then one from the other side that I'd like you guys to read and consider. It's the ones we sent out to you, what's laid out for you guys. You want to do the John 18?
Yeah.
Back and forth?
Sure, you want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so in your handout, we've got, starts at the bottom of page 1, goes over to 2. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they may eat the Passover. Then Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?"
They answered him and said, "If he were not an evildoer, a criminal, we would not have delivered him up to you."
Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law."
Therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death," that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die.
Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
Jesus answered and said, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you concerning me?"
Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?"
Jesus answered and said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here.
Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then?
Jesus answers, you rightly say that I'm a king. For this cause I was born. For this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who has of the truth hears my voice.
Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all.
Let me just read one other one to kind of leave you guys with the point where we're thinking you might want to consider. In John chapter 8, he starts in verse 42. Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceed forth from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. Because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? And then if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Who is of God hears God's words. Therefore, you do not hear them, because you are not of God. Just below that, something that's come from our society, this has been a little while ago, this was during Hitler's reign. Joseph Goebbels was the liar-in-chief of the Nazi regime. And you want to read that one, Jay, and just
Sure.
kind of run through it?
Sure. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state.
So I think we both truly do believe that there are forces at work right now that are trying to eliminate the Christian faith. You can pick out several different ones, but to me, it's academia that's trying to eliminate the Christian faith. And there's I'm not putting on all of them. There's great schools, there are, but I would say the vast majority are. I don't know how many of you guys seen the film God's Not Dead, and the little action portrayed in the film about the kid coming into the philosophy class, and the philosophy teacher is a new atheist, meaning they're really aggressive. And if you haven't seen that movie, rent it. It's out, and it's a really good description of exactly what's going on, because it's not just him. There was a book written of it by what's the one
Ben
that-
Stein,
Ben
expelled,
Expelled, no intelligence allowed.
right.
And he was interviewing professors that had been kicked out of college campuses because they're Christian and they're preaching the Christian faith. So it's where it's coming from, and I just feel like the idea is to make it so we can defend it in a reasonable fashion, and demonstrate our faith isn't just fantasy.
Very
That I
good.
personally think, me and Jay both think, atheism hasn't got a place to stand.
Well, we have something to consider as you depart and you're pondering, meditating over some of the things that have been talked about here. The full text of this, which Kelly just read from here, is in the handout, John 8:31 through 47. And you might want to read through that on your own time and think about another part of it. It's here in verse 41. They said to him, meaning Jesus, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, God. And I think looking at this text and in light of that one statement, what could be the apologist's view of this? And how might you have responded to somebody that might have brought up to you back at the day? Well, let me maybe give you a hint to lead into this. What is the fundamental presupposition, the false presupposition that's being operated on here? You cannot have a pregnancy without a sperm donor, right? Even though Isaiah prophesied something a little different. And so as you go through this text, take a few minutes and think about what J. Warner Wallace has said in these first 5 chapters, and how might you approach somebody that would take that statement, that naturalistic, limited view that's contrary to biblical revelation, and how might you respond?
Yep. Thanks for coming in, guys. Appreciate it. Next week, we're going to run through Does God Exist?
Next month.
Next month, yeah, not next week. Don't come next week, we won't be here.
So, what are the books here that you've got?
Oh, I'm reading this. There was a quote in here that
Okay. And then, but that one